Getting your first credit or debit card can feel like an exciting leap into adulthood, but complicated contracts and financial commitments can cause confusion for many people. Understanding the benefits and risks of credit and lending can help you make smart financial choices. How do you decide between getting a debit card or a credit card? The truth is, both have advantages and pitfalls, and it is helpful to think about how you will safely use a card when making a decision. Most banks include an option of attaching a debit card to your checking account. These cards are a convenient way of accessing your money for transactions you make in your daily life. Debit cards subtract money directly from your checking account, and transactions are not charged interest. You should ask about annual or transactional fees to have a good understanding of the cost of your debit card. Debit cards are tied directly to your money. So if your card number is lost or stolen, your money could disappear and you have limited protections. Credit cards, on the other hand, allow you to borrow money that must be repaid. In many cases, you may have one billing cycle before you pay any interest on the money borrowed. Credit cards have a wide variety of interest rates and may have annual or transactional fees, as well as incentives or rewards. So consider looking at several credit card offers before deciding which product to sign up for. Credit cards may have high interest rates, much higher than student, car, or home loans, so it is prudent to pay off all transactions you make each month. Accumulating interest month after month can make it very hard to pay your debt off. On the other hand, credit cards offer several advantages for consumers, including the chance to build your credit profile for future loans and improved financial security measures and fraud protections that protect you. No matter what type of accounts you choose to open, it can pay off to take some time to read and understand the fine print, including annual and transaction fees, interest rates, penalties, late fees, credit limits, security measures, and fraud protection before signing up for an account. Enroll in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to your YouTube channel or following us on social media. More resources are available in the Consumer Protection 101 webpage at www.dagcap.wi.gov